The summer of 1888 turned out to be a deadly summer in the Whitechapel district of London. Between August 31st and November 9th, 1888, 5 women were murdered and mutilated, and still no killer has been charged. The whole city was caught up in suspicion and fear. The newspapers called it the Autumn of Terror. The killer was thought to possibly be connected with up to 11 murders, but only 5 were ever confirmed. By the end of the year, London would actually have a total of 28 murders. So what makes Jack the Ripper and his 5 kills so interesting? Now, I could easily sit here and tell you all about Jack the Ripper, his victims, theories, and suspects, but that's been covered over and over again. Instead, I wanted to focus on the sensational story of London's first serial killer. People still today know who Jack the Ripper was, over many other more threatening serial killers. And for a mystery murderer who only killed 5 women in London in the space of 3 months, how did Jack become so infamous? It was the tabloids, the reporters, and the police. This hysteria was fueled by the media attention to the case. The Victorian tabloids would often print images of the bodies and the crime scenes, with graphic details of the murders. They would follow the entire story through to its end, often reporting court cases, and, if the perpetrator was sentenced, let everyone know what date and time so that they could come along to see the hanging themselves. Now, this wasn't new for the case of the Jack the Ripper, but in the late 1880s, they saw a spike in readership and a spike in sensationalism. News was becoming more about entertainment as much as it was about the truth. This case became the turning point of fake evidence, fake eyewitness reports, and sensationalized details. In fact, they terrorized the readership with these almost inhumane details. The press showed increasing interest in these murders from the very beginning. The Star, a recently launched newspaper in 1888, found that the more that they wrote about murder, the better their sales were. The Star's reporters actually connected the first confirmed Ripper murder with 2 previous murders of women in the East End, though they were entirely different MOs and circumstances. They were actually the ones that labelled this killing as a serial attack and began to call these killings the Whitechapel murders. They were the ones that first hit on the fact that spreading fear and anxiety about this killer on the loose would sell. The Star published accounts of this killer, though completely fabricated at this point. They wrote, "There is a maniac haunting Whitechapel. His expression is sinister and seems to be full of terror. His eyes are small and glittering. His lips are parted in a grin which is excessively repellent." Despite the fact that there were no witnesses to this. By the time of the second murder, people were already hooked on this story as it was unravelling. They published all the graphic details for the public to read, along with sensationalized reports about the body being found. And I will warn you, some of this is a bit graphic. The woman having been ripped up from groin to breastbone, the viscera had been pulled out and scattered in all directions. The heart and liver being placed behind her head, she was covered in blood and lying in a pool of it. Even excruciating detail of how the murder was committed. One wrote, "The knife was jabbed into the deceased at the lower part of the abdomen, and then drawn upwards, not once, but twice. The first cut veered to the right, slitting up to the groin, but the second cut went straight upwards along the centre of the body and reaching to the breastbone." Now keep in mind this was still in a time when people remembered going to see executions for a fun day out, so these gory details do seem extreme to us, but were a little more entertaining to readers back then. This widespread information created widespread concern and ultimately paranoia. Flyers were posted everywhere warning residents of the murderer on the loose. Even those outside of Whitechapel, the wealthier districts of London locked their doors for fear that this murderer would come and get them. Suspicions were also at an all-time high. Local businesses even formed a vigilante group of men to roam the streets at night and try and catch him. There is one noted incident where this mob spotted a lone man by one of the spots of a previous murder, and so they chased him. Others joined in, assuming that the mob had caught the real guy. And soon this mob caught the man, brought him to the police, demanding his immediate lynching because this man was for sure Jack the Ripper. Reporters themselves had to fish for more stories. And remember, this was in an age when policemen and detectives weren't yet established as an authority figure. So reporters would often sneak in with the interviews and eyewitness statements before even the police could, or even bribe the police for those key details. Sales themselves began to slow with the 2 weeks of no killing, and the newspapers were desperate for more. Almost right on time, on September 27th, a letter addressed to the boss arrived at the Central News Agency. It apparently came from the killer, and this letter gave a name to this infamous murderer. On September 30th, the killer attacks 2 women in one night, and the press eats it up. The police, on the other hand, were becoming desperate and make the decision to allow the press to print the letter in their newspapers, in the hope that it would bring forward more clues. October 1st, 1888, Jack the Ripper becomes a household name, and finally the media have their star. But how do we know that this letter was real? This sensationalized letter didn't give up any information that any reporter couldn't have gotten a hold of, and the fact that he gave himself a name, and a catchy name at that, immediately becomes suspect. This easily could have been someone trying to exploit the murders to create more news. And there have been attempts to prove that this was no killer. One documentary even pointing to a journalist from the Star who has suspiciously similar handwriting. Jack the Ripper sent the police and journalists a number of more letters in which he boasted of his actions and taunted the police. Some letters mostly seem to have been fraudulent, but others could be real. And I think the fact is that they don't really know for sure, nor perhaps will we ever know. In fact, over 1,000 letters were written by Jack the Ripper, but only 2 seem credible. Only one letter referenced evidence from one murder, actually containing a partial organ possibly from a victim. Otherwise, there was nothing to actually connect the same person to all 5 crime scenes. 2 reporters actually came forward in 1931 to reveal that they sent one of the postcards. The motive? Sales. Feature the killer's words in the newspaper and it sells out in seconds. And do you really think it's a coincidence that some of the letters were sent directly to the journalists? Even if it was the Ripper himself, why do we think we would send them to the newspapers? He either wanted the attention in a classic Zodiac killer kind of way, or wanted to help the newspapers sell. Newspapers found popular angles to keep up the stories, the intrigue and the fear to continue the sales. And it's important to note that these murders happened in a London that was experiencing extreme class divisions, economic uncertainty, and a booming population. The ability to be unknown, and a boom in immigration, and that classic us versus them type of feeling. These murders brought about a lot of finger-pointing at immigrants and highlighted the extreme xenophobia and anti-Semitism in London at the time. The Star was also the first paper to start accusing the killer as a Jewish person, and it turned that pointing fingers, no matter the truth behind it, really helped the papers fly off the presses. One newspaper noted that no Englishman could have committed these crimes. It had to have been a foreigner. In fact, almost all of the accused were either Jewish, foreign, upper class, or if not any of the above, they must have been mad. On top of the press accusing people, the police were also at fault for misleading evidence. A police sketch of the Ripper was created and released to the masses. This sketch had an undeniable Jewish appearance to it. What is unusual about this sketch is that there were no eyewitness accounts to have created this sketch. Only one person, a Mrs. Long, provided a limited description, and she only saw the back of a man who was last seen with one of the victims. So who was the person in the sketch? And what about the victims? Their pictures were all over the newspaper, but it was actually less for mourning their death and more to create fear and entertainment. All 5 victims were apparently prostitutes, but there's actually no hard evidence that 3 out of 5 of these women were. So why do we remember it that way? Well, it's primarily because that is the story that was sold. These murders were painted as targeting prostitutes and women who were down on their luck. The sensationalism of the journalism aimed to highlight the plight of the lower classes, what poor circumstances the victims were in, and the state of their lives when they were still alive. For some, this called for social reform, and for others this was simply a way to relieve any worry, since they were living in squalor and they were prostitutes, so that was brought upon them. And actually because of this, the victims had little public sympathy. Some reform and concern was shown, but it was very obviously from guilty readers who didn't know that things were that bad. In accusation of this is an article published by Bernard Shaw, which was published the 24th of September. It was called Blood Money to Whitechapel. In it, he said that the newfound desire for philanthropy and reform in the East End had arrived due to the blood spilt by the victims of Jack the Ripper. The suffering of the East End had to be publicised in order to get the attention of the upper classes, and to do that they had to sensationalise these murders and reveal the credible threat of the Ripper, if not the terrible conditions that they already lived in. Some of the press attention simply bolstered Whitehall's reputation for vice and villainy, and somewhere you should probably avoid if you could afford to. On top of all of this, the gory details, the pointing of the finger and the victim shaming, this really was the first exposure to the concept of a serial killer, and especially the fear of being prey to someone with the intent of killing again. However, some have speculated that these murders, though all gruesome, may not even be connected, and that the killer might not even be the same person. The Ripper may just as well be a construct of fear and media speculation as he could be a real serial killer. The Star did this after the very first murder and tried to connect it to another 3 that had nothing to do with each other. So what makes these next 4 any different? Or the other 10 that they tried to tie to him too? Media may have just distorted these events to make something a little bit more interesting to read. One of the most fascinating things about Jack the Ripper is just how suddenly this so-called killing spree began, and more importantly, how quickly it ended. What made him stop? His last known murder victim was Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th. 8 months later, another body was found with a very similar MO. The doctor concluded that this was another victim of Jack the Ripper, but the police disagreed. The press did their very best to stir up a frenzy again, claiming that the Ripper had returned, but that soon died down again. It was 3 years later that the police had to give up and the case was cold. But it was the media that played a part in continuing the hype around this figure, and interest in the killings continued on. Slowly as time went on, despite the fact that they still hadn't caught the Ripper, London's citizens kind of moved on. It was as if they had gotten bored of this old gossip and began to use the Ripper as something of a joke, and painted him almost like a boogeyman that they would tell their children about. But because this case is still unsolved, it will always create suspicion and intrigue. This was the beginning of the tabloid newspapers. giving the readers what they wanted to read despite the truth behind reporting. And this is why we still know Jack the Ripper today. He could have easily been forgotten through history, but because of the sensationalism tied with his name and the murders of 1888, we still want to know who he was. If you want to do some research yourself, go check out Jack the Ripper Casebook, which I'll link down below, and you can go through all of his letters, the photos, and the newspaper reporting on it. But overall, the facts that we have, these murders are still unsolved. His identity is still a mystery. And no matter how many new documentaries come out with the DNA evidence or some new uncovered suspects, we will never truly know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.